California, 1998. A cold case that haunted a quiet coastal town has finally been solved. Rachel Marie Donnelly, a 31-year-old freelance photojournalist known for her compassion and courage, vanished without a trace. Her abandoned car was found at a cliffside turnout, camera bag still inside. For years, leads dried up. Rumors swirled. Hope faded, until DNA uncovered a truth no one expected. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Rachel Marie Donnelly was the kind of person who quietly held a town together without anyone fully realizing it, until she was gone. In the picturesque coastal town of Pacific Grove, California, she was a fixture. Always present, rarely in the spotlight. At 31 years old, Rachel had carved out a life as a freelance photojournalist, balancing a quiet personal world with a passionate eye for public truth. Her photos often graced the covers of local newspapers and regional magazines, capturing not just moments but meaning. She lived in a modest one-story bungalow, painted a pale seafoam green, nestled just 2 blocks from the shore. Her yard was filled with wildflowers and wind chimes. It was the kind of home you'd walk by and imagine belonged to an artist, and in many ways it did. Rachel's vintage film camera was as much a part of her identity as her calm smile and signature ocean blue scarf. Neighbors saw her biking past at dawn or dusk, often chasing golden hour light along the bluffs. She wasn't just documenting nature, she was protecting it through exposure. Rachel came from a family of educators. Her parents, both retired high school teachers, lived just 30 minutes away in Salinas. They spoke on the phone every Sunday without fail, discussing everything from politics to the latest bird sightings. She wasn't married, had no children, and yet her life felt full. She had her work, her community, and a close-knit circle of friends who often gathered at her house for home-cooked vegetarian meals and documentary screenings. In the final days before her disappearance, Rachel had been working on a story related to environmental degradation along the Big Sur coastline. She had just returned from a week-long solo trip photographing erosion and illegal dumping along protected cliffsides, something she'd hinted could ruffle feathers. She met up with a friend 2 nights before she vanished and mentioned feeling like someone had been watching her, though she quickly brushed it off with a laugh. That friend, an editor at a local weekly, later recalled Rachel seemed distracted, nervous even. But Rachel was known for being fiercely independent, sometimes to a fault. She never liked making others worry, never dramatized anything. Her neighbors described her as the kind of woman who'd drop everything to help a stray animal or volunteer for a local protest, but who also kept her personal fears close to the chest. A silent observer of the world, she processed danger through the lens of her camera, not her emotions, and that lens had recently been pointed at something, or someone, she hadn't fully revealed. Her last known photograph, taken 2 days before her disappearance, was of a crumbling fence at the edge of a cliff, with a shadowy figure in the distant background. The photo was blurry, almost accidental but haunting. Investigators later found it in her darkroom, undeveloped film still drying. Rachel's final days were filled with routine, a grocery run, a client meeting, dinner with a friend. Nothing outwardly alarming. But beneath the calm surface there was a building sense of unease. Something she hadn't spoken of. Something she didn't have the chance to finish. Because just days later, Rachel would vanish, leaving behind only questions, half-developed photos, and a town that would never be the same. But what would cause someone to target a woman like Rachel? And who might have known what she was working on? Saturday, September 19, 1998, began with an eerie quiet over Pacific Grove. The fog rolled in thick from the ocean, swallowing the cliffs and blanketing the town in gray. It was the kind of morning that muffled sound that made everything feel a little slower, a little more distant. At the Monterey Bay Marine Wildlife Center, staff were setting up for a scheduled shoot with Rachel Marie Donnelly, who was supposed to document a sea otter rehabilitation program. But by 9 a.m., there was no sign of her. At first, no one panicked. Rachel was a free spirit, known to get caught up chasing light or stopping to shoot a spontaneous moment. But as the day wore on and she still hadn't called or arrived, subtle concern became palpable unease. Calls went to voicemail. Her editor left messages. By sunset, her closest friend and neighbor, Elena Hart, drove to Rachel's bungalow, only to find the lights off and the house exactly as it had been the day before. Mail sat untouched. Her bike was still chained by the porch. Inside, nothing was out of place. No signs of a hurried departure, no notes, no packed bags. That night, around 10:15 p.m., a tourist pulling over to take in the moonlit waves from a scenic overlook along Highway 1 noticed something strange. A silver Toyota Corolla sat parked, slightly tilted toward the edge, headlights off, doors locked. The windows were fogged over from the cool air, but inside, in plain sight on the passenger seat, was a worn canvas camera bag. The keys were still in the ignition. Nothing else seemed disturbed. Police were called shortly after midnight. The car was registered to Rachel Donnelly. The next morning, Sunday the 20th, she was officially reported missing. A flurry of activity followed. Friends printed missing posters and plastered them across Pacific Grove, Monterey, and even as far as Carmel. Her photo appeared on the front page of the local paper under the headline, "Where is Rachel Donnelly?" Community members gathered to search the cliffs and wooded trails. Local divers volunteered to check below the overlook, fearing the worst, that she may have slipped and fallen into the Pacific, but no footprints led away from the car. There were no drag marks, no blood, no broken glass. It was as if Rachel had evaporated into the fog. Detectives dug into her life. Interviews were conducted. Her parents were devastated but cooperative, providing names of everyone they believed she'd recently interacted with. Her ex-boyfriend, a local writer, had an alibi. Her most recent photography subjects, including controversial environmental activists and small business owners, were interviewed. A few admitted to heated disagreements over Rachel's photojournalism coverage. Some felt exposed. One referred to her work as meddling. Still, there was no evidence pointing to any of them. Rachel's cell phone records revealed her last outgoing call was to her editor at 6:47 p.m., the night before she disappeared. She mentioned finalizing a photo series but didn't mention where she'd be going next. Her camera's memory cards, when later checked, held nothing recent, suggesting she never made it to her next shoot. Speculation grew. Some wondered if she had taken her own life, but those closest to her rejected the idea. Rachel was passionate, focused, and had recently secured a major freelance contract. Others whispered about someone targeting her for what she had photographed. A few even believed she'd uncovered something she wasn't supposed to. But without a body, without evidence of a struggle, the question remained maddeningly open. If Rachel didn't choose to disappear, who took her and why? 17 long days after Rachel Donnelly disappeared, the silence finally broke. Not with a press conference, not with a confession, but with a tragic discovery made by accident. On October 6, 1998, just after noon, a retired forestry worker named Harold Pinter was hiking a narrow, overgrown trail in the heart of the Monterey pine forest, about 5 miles inland from the Highway 1 overlook where Rachel's car had been found. It was a rugged area, dense, quiet, rarely visited except by experienced hikers and researchers. Harold was scouting the area for mushroom growth when he noticed something odd beneath a tangle of dry brush. At first, he thought it was trash, but as he stepped closer, he froze. Partially visible in the dirt was what appeared to be a piece of cloth, and beside it the unmistakable glint of jewelry, a small silver ring, and a press badge etched with Rachel Donnelly's name. A half-buried boot and exposed fragments of human bone confirmed what he feared. Emergency. Services responded within the hour. The scene was immediately cordoned off. Forensic teams moved carefully, painstakingly sifting through layers of pine needles and soil. Wildlife had disturbed the site, scattering parts of the remains over a 20-foot radius. Still, enough remained to make identification possible. A forensic odontologist used dental records to confirm the victim's identity. It was Rachel. The autopsy, though limited due to the advanced state of decomposition, revealed 2 grim details: signs of blunt force trauma to the skull and fractures consistent with manual strangulation. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Toxicology results were inconclusive as too much time had passed. The coroner's official ruling, homicide. Rachel had not fallen. She had not run away. She had been murdered, and her killer had hidden her body in a place few would ever think to look. The press swarmed the small town. "Photojournalist found dead," the headlines read. Candlelight vigils sprang up throughout Pacific Grove. Hundreds gathered to honor her life, many holding up black and white prints of her most iconic photographs. Her parents, now visibly shattered, made a public plea for answers. Someone did this. Someone knows something. Please come forward. The police doubled their efforts. Dozens of officers combed the forest for evidence. Soil samples were taken. Rachel's clothing was analyzed for fibers. A cigarette butt was discovered near the remains, unusual since Rachel didn't smoke. Investigators preserved it as possible evidence. But as days turned into weeks, no solid leads emerged. No murder weapon was ever found. There were no fresh footprints, no tire tracks, no traceable DNA under her fingernails. Whoever had killed Rachel knew how to avoid detection, or had simply gotten lucky. The community struggled to make sense of it. Pacific Grove was not a place known for violence. The idea that someone could commit such a brutal act, dispose of a body so carefully and vanish completely, it didn't seem possible. And yet, it had happened. Theories once again flooded in. Was this a crime of passion? A random act? Something tied to her work? Many believed Rachel had gotten too close to something or someone she shouldn't have. But without proof, those were only stories. Whispers. In the absence of answers, suspicion spread like smoke through the town. Strangers eyed one another differently. Trust eroded. The idyllic quiet of Pacific Grove was fractured, and for detectives, one thing was clear. How could someone commit such a brutal crime and vanish without a trace in a town so small? With Rachel Donnelly's remains now discovered and her death ruled a homicide, the full weight of the investigation descended on Pacific Grove's small, overworked police department. The pressure was immense, and from the public, from Rachel's grieving parents, and from the media, which had transformed the quiet journalist into a statewide symbol of a justice system in limbo. Detectives began to retrace every step of her final days, starting with her photography assignments. Rachel had a reputation for documenting issues that mattered, from gentrification to pollution to local government scandals. Her camera lens, although quiet, often unsettled those in power. Investigators compiled a list of names, people she had interviewed, photographed, argued with, or exposed in the months leading up to her death. Among them was a local fisherman, Joel Hernandez, who had once been the subject of Rachel's environmental expose on illegal fishing practices. Hernandez had a misdemeanor assault charge from years prior and was known for his temper, but during questioning he provided a solid alibi. He'd been in Baja California during the week Rachel vanished. His passport and travel records checked out. Then came Malcolm Bryce, a former city council member who had resigned following a corruption investigation. One of Rachel's photos, published in a local paper, had shown him leaving a closed-door meeting with a real estate developer, a moment that sparked public outrage. When detectives spoke to Bryce, he was defensive but cooperative. He denied any involvement and claimed he hadn't seen Rachel in over a year. His home was searched, but nothing tied him to the crime. And then there was a man named Darren Cole, a neighbor who lived just 3 houses down from Rachel. A loner in his mid-40s, Cole was known for watching Rachel's house from his porch, occasionally making unwanted small talk. One friend recalled Rachel calling him creepy but harmless. Investigators brought him in for questioning. His garage was searched, but there was no forensic evidence, no direct link to the crime scene, and legally, suspicion wasn't enough. As detectives combed through Rachel's life, a personal journal found in her nightstand added a chilling layer to the mystery. Weeks before her disappearance, she had written, "Feeling followed lately. Not sure if it's paranoia or something real. Someone watching me during my cliff shoot yesterday didn't recognize them." The entry sent chills down the spines of those investigating, but it lacked specifics. No names, no photos. Just a creeping fear that now felt prophetic. Police checked local surveillance. From gas stations and nearby businesses near the overlook. Nothing. There were no license plate. Readers in the area in 1998. No traffic cameras. The forest where her body had been found had no regular foot traffic or monitoring. It was a dead zone, for evidence and for accountability. The only physical clue of interest was the cigarette butt found near her remains. It had been carefully bagged and frozen, awaiting a day when technology could extract more from degraded samples. In 1998, that day hadn't arrived. The DNA recovered was partial, insufficient for a viable match in existing databases. Months passed. Leads grew thinner. A rotation of detectives took over the case, each bringing a new perspective. but none cracking it. Tips came in, sightings, rumors, even a couple false confessions. All led nowhere. Rachel's parents, once quiet and patient, became increasingly vocal. They gave interviews, held community rallies, and publicly criticized the department's slow progress. "Our daughter was hunted," her mother said at one vigil. "We will not let this become another forgotten California cold case." But even their pleas couldn't force a breakthrough. The trail was growing cold, and darker questions lingered beneath the surface. Would the truth be found in her photos? Or was her killer someone no one ever suspected? By the spring of 2000, the once urgent investigation into Rachel Marie Donnelly's murder had faded into the background. New crimes demanded attention. New tragedies captured headlines. And for the town of Pacific Grove, life slowly, awkwardly, moved on. But not for Rachel's parents. Evelyn and Martin Donnelly refused to let their daughter become just another statistic in California's long list of unsolved homicides. With no justice and no closure, they channeled their grief into purpose. They founded the Rachel Donnelly Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting young female photojournalists. The foundation offered an annual scholarship to women pursuing journalism, particularly those focused on social justice or environmental issues, just like Rachel had. They organized community events on her birthday and the anniversary of her death. Candlelight walks, photography exhibits, storytelling circles, all designed to keep Rachel's spirit and story alive. In 2001, they launched a simple but powerful website, Justice for Rachel, where they published timelines, photos, and a plea for any new information. Visitors from around the country left messages of support, but no leads. Inside the police department, Rachel's file sat on a metal shelf in a gray binder marked Cold. The Cold Case Unit, small and underfunded, reviewed her case every 6 months as policy required. But with no new evidence, no fresh witnesses, and no forensic advancements capable of processing the degraded DNA sample from the cigarette butt, there was little progress to make. Worse yet, the detectives originally assigned to Rachel's case had either retired or transferred. New officers inherited the file with less emotional investment and more bureaucratic fatigue. Over time, enthusiasm gave way to quiet resignation. In one internal memo, a supervisor wrote, "Unless new evidence surfaces, this case remains inactive." The town, too, began to forget. As the years passed, businesses changed hands, neighbors moved, and new residents arrived with no memory of Rachel's disappearance. Her name faded from conversations. The overlook where her car had been found was repaved. The trail near her final resting place became overgrown again. The forest, indifferent, reclaimed what it had seen, but the Donnellys refused to forget. Every Christmas they left a single candle in their window for her. Every local paper that failed to mention her on the anniversary of her death received a letter from Martin. And every time a new police chief was sworn in, Evelyn sent a handwritten note. "Please don't forget our daughter." By 2008, a decade had passed. The world had changed. Cell phones, digital cameras, the rise of social media. But Rachel's case remained exactly where it had been on the day they found her. Cold, stagnant, unsolved. On the 10th anniversary of her death, the town gathered for a memorial service at Lovers Point Park, overlooking the same coastline where Rachel once biked with her camera. Martin Donnelly stood before a small crowd of family, friends, and former colleagues. His voice trembled as he spoke. Rachel had a gift for capturing truth in a single frame. She saw the world clearly even when others looked away, and yet her own truth remains hidden, buried somewhere beneath layers of silence and dust. We won't stop looking. We won't stop asking, because someone out there knows what happened, and one day the silence will break. But as the crowd dispersed and the vigil candles flickered out, the silence remained. Would justice ever arrive? Or was the silence permanent? In early 2021, hope flickered back to life in one of California's forgotten cold cases. The California Department of Justice had launched a new initiative that year, aimed at leveraging advanced forensic technology to revisit unsolved homicides. At the heart of the program was a rapidly evolving tool, forensic genetic genealogy. By cross-referencing old DNA evidence with public genealogical databases, investigators were solving cases once thought unsolvable. For families like the Donnellys, it was the kind of progress they had prayed for but dared not expect. Rachel Donnelly's case was among the dozens selected. Quietly, carefully, the Department of Justice's Cold Case Division retrieved the frozen cigarette butt collected near Rachel's remains back in 1998. The evidence had been preserved in a deep freeze vault for over 2 decades, waiting for science to catch up. Forensic analysts at a Sacramento lab extracted a degraded but viable DNA profile, still partial, but now enough to build a genealogical tree. Using a combination of YSTR markers and autosomal DNA, specialists began constructing potential familial connections. After several weeks of data cross-referencing and tree building, they got a hit. A familial match traced to a man living in Humboldt County, a man named Thomas Reed. At 53, Thomas Reed was a recluse. He lived in a remote cabin on the edge of the Six Rivers National Forest. Off the grid, mostly cash-based, with no recent run-ins with law enforcement. But his past told a different story. In the late 1990s, Reed had worked for the city of Pacific Grove as a part-time maintenance worker, primarily responsible for clearing brush along hiking trails. It placed him in direct proximity to the forested area where Rachel's body was discovered, and yet he had never been questioned during the original investigation. His name never appeared in witness statements, tip lines, or interviews. In 1999, less than a year after Rachel's murder, Reed quietly left Pacific Grove. No forwarding address. No public goodbye. Just gone. That detail alone raised eyebrows. Armed with the new DNA connection and Reed's proximity to the original crime scene, the cold case unit reopened the file. But this time they did it in silence. No press releases. No warnings. Surveillance was initiated in early May 2021. Undercover officers monitored Reed's movements, habits, and, most critically, collected discarded items for DNA comparison. In one instance, agents retrieved a beer can Reed had tossed into a public recycling bin. Lab results confirmed it. The DNA matched the partial profile from the cigarette butt found near Rachel's body. The chain was tightening. Investigators built a timeline. Reed's employment history placed him in Pacific Grove from 1995 to early 1999. He had worked on the exact trails where Rachel's remains had been recovered. Colleagues described him as quiet, odd, and vaguely standoffish. One recalled a moment in late 1998 when Reed showed up to work with scratches on his arms and a torn shirt. He'd claimed he'd fallen during trail work. Still, there were gaps. There was no direct evidence tying Reed to Rachel in life. No confirmed interactions. No eyewitnesses. No weapon. But the DNA, however partial, told a story. And in the eyes of investigators, it was time to move. The Pacific Grove Police Department, in coordination with the DOJ and Humboldt County Sheriff's Office, prepared to make an arrest. They drafted a warrant, reviewed the evidence one last time, and waited for the right moment. Thomas Reed had no idea the walls were closing in, that the cold case he thought time had buried was about to resurface. But could DNA alone tie him to Rachel's murder? And what would the arrest reveal? On a crisp February morning in 2023, the California Department of Justice, in collaboration with Humboldt County deputies and Pacific Grove Police, descended on a secluded campground just outside Eureka. They moved swiftly and silently, armed with a warrant and over 2 decades of questions. At the center of their operation was one man, Thomas Reed. He was found sitting outside his camper, sipping coffee and reading a paperback novel. When officers approached, Reed appeared confused but compliant. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. It was almost as if he'd been waiting. The arrest sent shockwaves through Pacific Grove. Though many years had passed, the name Rachel Donnelly still stirred emotion, especially among longtime residents who remembered her as the woman with the camera and quiet courage. The moment the news broke, headlines swept across California. 1998, cold case solved. Thomas Reed arrested in Rachel Donnelly murder. For some, it was a name they'd never heard before. For others, it was a name they never expected to hear again. Reed had lived a ghost-like existence since leaving Pacific Grove in 1999. He moved north, drifting between labor jobs and temporary campsites, avoiding digital footprints and keeping interactions minimal. What raised even more suspicion was his complete lack of presence in the original investigation. Not a single note, witness statement, or police log had ever mentioned him. Yet he'd worked for the city at the time, assigned to trail maintenance in the very section of forest where Rachel was found. In custody, Reed denied everything. He claimed he didn't know Rachel, had never met her, and had no knowledge of her death. He admitted to smoking near the area during his time with the Parks Department, but said that was all it was. Coincidence. But detectives had more than just his DNA. Upon executing a search warrant at a storage unit, Reed had rented under a false name. Investigators uncovered a pawnshop receipt from November 1998. The item listed a Canon AE-1 film camera, Rachel Donnelly's model, serial number etched beneath the battery housing. The pawn ticket listed the seller as Eric Lane, an alias previously linked to Reed in a 2004 misdemeanor case. Even more telling? The camera had been professionally wiped clean. No fingerprints, no trace of film. Cold and clinical, it had been stripped of everything but its shell. It was the break detectives had spent 25 years waiting for. In Pacific Grove, disbelief turned to stunned silence. Crowds gathered outside City Hall. Former classmates of Rachel's, colleagues, neighbors, they all shared a single question. How had he gone unnoticed for so long? Witnesses came forward slowly. One man recalled Reed standing near a protest Rachel photographed in 1998. Another remembered him lingering around the edge of an environmental town hall Rachel had covered. No one thought much of it then, but now, in hindsight, the patterns became haunting. Rachel's parents released a written statement to the press. For 25 years, we held on to hope. We never gave up, and neither did justice. Our daughter's light was stolen, but today we feel the first flicker of peace. But peace would not come so easily. As the prosecution prepared its case, legal experts cautioned that while the DNA and the camera linked Reed to Rachel's final days, they didn't definitively prove murder. Defense attorneys were already crafting their counterarguments. Yes, Reed had her camera. Yes, his DNA was at the scene. But was that enough? Would the justice system finally bring peace, or deliver more questions than answers? On October 21, 2024, after nearly 26 years of silence, the state of California versus Thomas Reed began in a Monterey County courtroom. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Carla Jimenez, knew the case would be an uphill battle. Time had eroded the physical evidence. Witnesses' memories had faded. But they also knew they had something powerful, a story that spanned decades, a family's unrelenting pursuit of justice, and a victim whose voice still echoed through the photographs she left behind. Courtroom seats filled quickly each morning. Journalists lined the hallway. Members of the Pacific Grove community showed up in quiet solidarity, many holding prints of Rachel's photographs in their laps. Rachel's parents were there every day, sitting side by side, hands clasped, their grief visible but dignified. The prosecution began by painting a portrait of Thomas Reed not as a career criminal, but as a loner with a pattern of erratic behavior and a chilling ability to vanish in plain sight. They presented evidence that placed Reed on the trail near where Rachel's body had been found, in his capacity as a city employee. They introduced the cigarette butt, now definitively matched to Reed's DNA, and connected it to the crime scene. The Canon AE-1 camera, Rachel's, was traced through a pawn receipt to an alias Reed had used in 1998. Prosecutors argued that Reed had likely encountered Rachel while she was working on assignment, possibly followed her, and murdered her in a secluded area of the forest. They didn't claim to know the exact motive, but they introduced journal entries from Rachel herself, suggesting she had felt followed in the weeks before her death. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to suggest a pattern. The defense hit back hard. They claimed the DNA on the cigarette butt could have been left days or even weeks before the murder. They argued the chain of custody had gaps, suggesting the evidence might have been mishandled. They brought in an expert witness who testified that long-term storage of evidence can lead to partial degradation and possible contamination. They also challenged the pawn ticket, saying that linking Eric Lane to Thomas Reed was speculative. There is no direct evidence, the defense attorney stated, that puts Mr. Reed with Ms. Donnelly in her final hours. The prosecution is asking you to convict based on assumptions. Throughout the trial, Reed sat silently. No emotion, no remorse, He never looked toward Rachel's family. He never spoke. The most emotional moments came from the witness stand. Rachel's mother broke down while recounting the last phone call she had with her daughter. Her father read an excerpt from Rachel's journal. Her former editor described Rachel's fearless pursuit of the truth, her empathy, and the countless stories she brought to light. Forensic analysts explained the DNA process in painstaking detail, reinforcing that while partial, the genetic markers were conclusive and statistically rare. They reaffirmed that the odds of the cigarette butt belonging to someone other than Thomas Reed were infinitesimally small. After 6 weeks of testimony, evidence, and heartache, the case went to the jury. For 3 long days, Rachel's family waited, reliving every moment, every photograph, every headline. On November 30th, 2024, the verdict came in, guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom gasped. Rachel's mother clutched a framed photograph of her daughter and wept openly. Her father closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. Strangers embraced. Even seasoned journalists struggled to hold back emotion. After 26 years, a name had been spoken. A verdict had been rendered. But as the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, a deeper question remained. Beyond the verdict, what legacy would Rachel's life and death leave behind? In the months following the conviction of Thomas Reed, Rachel Donnelly's name took on new life, not as a footnote in a cold case file, but as a symbol of perseverance, truth, and the enduring power of one woman's voice. Her parents, Evelyn and Martin Donnelly, became accidental advocates. After spending nearly 3 decades trapped in the purgatory of grief, they emerged into a new role, torchbearers for change. The first initiative was announced only weeks after the verdict, the Rachel Donnelly Fellowship for Investigative Photojournalism, funded by donations from across the country. Its mission was simple: to support young female journalists who, like Rachel, dared to document the world with both compassion and courage. Applications poured in. College campuses hosted panels on Rachel's work. Professors used her story to teach students about the risks and responsibilities of truth-telling. Her name, once whispered in heartbreak, was now spoken with reverence. But Rachel's legacy wasn't confined to journalism. Her case, and the failures that surrounded it for so long, triggered a closer look at how California handled cold cases. State lawmakers, citing Rachel's name directly in floor hearings, passed legislation allocating increased funding for forensic backlog processing. Cold case units across the state were given renewed support. DNA testing initiatives were expanded, and new training protocols for evidence preservation were implemented. Rachel's case had become a catalyst for systemic reform. Back in Pacific Grove, the transformation was personal. The Pacific Weekly Chronicle, the paper where Rachel had once contributed freelance photo essays, created a permanent honor in her name, the Rachel Donnelly Award for Courage in Local Reporting. Each year, it would be given to a journalist who challenged authority, exposed injustice, or gave voice to the unheard, the very things Rachel dedicated her life to capturing. In May 2025, on what would have been Rachel's 58th birthday, her parents returned to the forest clearing, where her body had been discovered nearly 27 years earlier. The area had changed. Time had softened its edges. A simple memorial stone had been placed there, unobtrusive, elegant. It read, "Rachel Marie Donnelly, she saw the world and showed us all." Standing there, Evelyn placed a hand on the stone while Martin spoke softly to a small group of friends, reporters, and former investigators. She never stopped telling stories. Even in death, he said, voice cracking, she found a way to speak. That same week, a local art gallery opened a special exhibit, Through Rachel's Eyes, curated from her recovered negatives and film prints, some of which had been lost, undeveloped, or overlooked for years. The gallery showcased the depth of Rachel's vision. Environmental protests, children playing by the sea, decaying fences along the cliffs. One wall was devoted entirely to self-portraits, moments of stillness, reflection, and quiet resilience. The gallery opening drew hundreds. Young photographers stood beside older journalists, inspired not just by Rachel's work, but by her story, a reminder that what we leave behind can speak louder than anything we say while alive. In interviews, Students and journalists alike referenced her often. "She's why I picked up a camera," one said. "She turned silence into light," another wrote on the gallery's guestbook. Justice had come, slowly, imperfectly, painfully. But it had come, and as her legacy unfolded across scholarships, legislation, exhibits, and words on a printed page, one truth became undeniable. Rachel's voice never truly left. It just found 1,000 new ways to be heard. Rachel Marie Donnelly lived with a camera in her hand and conviction in her heart. She wasn't a celebrity or a political figure. She was a freelance photojournalist in a small California town, someone who chose to tell the stories that others overlooked. But when she vanished in 1998, the silence surrounding her case became deafening. Her disappearance shook Pacific Grove, and her unsolved murder haunted the state for decades. It wasn't until 2021, 23 years later, that a degraded cigarette butt, long preserved in evidence, would finally speak the truth. Through evolving DNA technology and a genealogy breakthrough, the past reached forward and pointed to her killer. But justice didn't come solely from science. It came from persistence, from the unwavering love of her parents, the dedication of cold case investigators, and the community that refused to forget. Her case did more than close a file. It opened doors for others. It reignited efforts to fund cold case units, process forensic backlogs, and elevate protections for female journalists working in silence and danger. Through new laws, scholarships, and memorials, Rachel's life became more than a headline. It became a symbol of justice that doesn't expire. Today, her photographs hang in galleries. Her name is spoken in journalism classrooms, and her voice, silenced far too soon, now echoes louder than ever through those she inspires. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Share it, remember Rachel, and speak up, for truth, for justice, and for the voices still waiting to be heard. Let Rachel's legacy remind us all, justice may sleep, but it never dies.